The Navy SEAL threw down his rifle in frustration after missing the target for the 10th time. "This weapon is completely screwed up," he shouted. That's when the quiet college girl changing targets 500 yards away spoke up for the first time all morning. What she said next made 8 elite warriors go completely silent. Welcome to Hidden Legends. Before we begin this powerful story of courage, skill, and forgotten heroism, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. Madison Foster had perfected the art of being invisible. At 22 years old, she'd been working at the Oceanside Precision Range for 9 months, arriving every morning at 5:45 a.m. to prepare for what would inevitably be another day of staying out of everyone's way. Her job was simple: change targets, sweep brass, restock ammunition, and most importantly, remain unnoticed. The range sat on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, 20 minutes south of Camp Pendleton. It was the kind of place that attracted serious shooters, military contractors, law enforcement, and occasionally elite units who needed a private facility for specialized training. Madison had learned early that these customers preferred their range staff to be efficient, quiet, and forgettable. She wore the same uniform every day: khaki cargo pants, a navy blue polo shirt with the range logo, and work boots that had seen better days. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she kept her interactions with customers to the absolute minimum required for politeness. "Good morning," "Right away, sir," and "Have a good day" comprised about 90% of her vocabulary during work hours. The job paid for her community college tuition and helped support her younger brother while their mother worked double shifts at the hospital. Madison was studying business administration, though she had no real passion for it. It seemed practical, safe, the kind of degree that might lead to a stable office job where she could continue being invisible, just in a different setting. What the customers didn't know was that Madison had been around firearms her entire life. Her father, Staff Sergeant Michael Foster, had been an Army Ranger before an IED took his life when Madison was 16. Before his deployment, he'd taught her to shoot on weekends at their local range, starting with a .22 rifle when she was 12 and gradually working up to centerfire cartridges. "Shooting is about respect," he'd told her during one of their sessions. "Respect for the weapon, respect for the target, and most importantly, respect for the fundamentals. If you master the basics, everything else is just arithmetic." Those weekend sessions had stopped abruptly when he deployed. After the funeral, Madison couldn't bring herself to touch a firearm for years. The range job had been a practical decision, not an emotional one. Good pay, flexible hours, and the irony wasn't lost on her that she was making money in a place she once loved but could no longer participate in. But working at the range had awakened something she'd tried to bear. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, she watched shooters of every skill level. Beginners who flinched at every shot, competitors who treated each round like a science experiment, and professionals who made impossible shots look routine. Despite herself, she began cataloging their techniques, noting what worked and what didn't. Her father's voice echoed in her mind during these observations. She could almost hear him critiquing the shooter's form, explaining why someone was pulling shots to the left, or why another was struggling with follow-up shots. The muscle memory of proper shooting technique remained buried beneath years of avoidance, but it was still there. The irony was that Madison had probably observed more shooting technique in 9 months at the range than most recreational shooters would see in a lifetime. She'd watched Marine Scout snipers work through long-range problems, FBI agents practice urban precision shots, and local SWAT teams run dynamic drills. Each session had taught her something, even if she wasn't consciously trying to learn. She'd become an expert on the subtle signs that indicated a shooter's problems, the way someone's breathing pattern affected their natural point of aim, how grip pressure influenced recoil management, the difference between a shooter who understood trigger control and one who was just hoping for the best. All knowledge she kept to herself, filed away in a mind that had become an unwitting database of marksmanship technique. That Tuesday morning in October started like any other. Madison arrived before dawn, turned on the lights, and began her routine. The Navy had booked the entire long-range section for the day, which meant she'd be busy running targets back and forth while trying to remain invisible. She'd seen SEALs train before. They were professional, focused, and generally left the staff alone to do their jobs. What she hadn't expected was Rodriguez. Petty Officer First Class Carlos Rodriguez was not having a good morning. In fact, he was having the worst training day of his career, and it was happening in front of 7 teammates who were beginning to question whether he belonged on the team at all. Rodriguez had been with SEAL Team 7 for only 3 months, having transferred from a conventional Navy unit after completing BODS training. On paper, he was qualified. He'd passed all the required courses, met the physical standards, and demonstrated competency with standard weapons systems. But long-range precision shooting had never been his strength, and today that weakness was on full display. The target was positioned at 500 yards, a distance that should have been routine for any SEAL. Using a precision rifle system with match-grade ammunition and perfect weather conditions, Rodriguez should have been grouping shots within a few inches of center. Instead, his bullets were scattered across the target like a shotgun pattern, when they hit the target at all. His team leader, Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison, was running out of patience. Morrison was a 15-year veteran with multiple deployments and a reputation for turning average sailors into elite operators. He'd seen struggling shooters before, but Rodriguez's problems seemed to go beyond simple inexperience. "Take your time, Rodriguez," Morrison called from the spotting position. "Remember your breathing. Natural respiratory pause." Rodriguez nodded, trying to control his mounting frustration. He knew the fundamentals, every SEAL did, but knowing and executing were proving to be very different things. His shots were consistently pulling to the left, and the harder he tried to compensate, the worse they became. Behind the firing line, the other team members watched with a mixture of concern and barely concealed skepticism. SEAL teams were tight-knit units where every member's performance could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. A weak link wasn't just a personal problem, it was a team liability. "Maybe it's the scope," Rodriguez muttered after his latest shot went wide. "The adjustment might be off." Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Chen, the team's designated marksman, stepped forward. "Scope's fine. I zeroed it this morning and put 5 shots in a 2-inch group." The implication was clear: the equipment wasn't the problem. Rodriguez felt heat rise in his cheeks. He'd been struggling with this rifle system for weeks, and the pressure was mounting. And the team's weakness was identified quickly and addressed harshly. If he couldn't master basic precision shooting, his future as a SEAL was in serious doubt. Morrison checked his watch. They'd been on the range for 2 hours, and Rodriguez had burned through nearly 100 rounds of expensive match ammunition with little to show for it. The other team members needed trigger time too, and Morrison was starting to consider cutting Rodriguez's session short. "Let's try a different approach," Morrison said, moving to stand behind Rodriguez. "I'm going to watch your form while you take the next shot. Talk me through your process." Rodriguez settled behind the rifle, acutely aware that all eyes were on him. "Natural point of aim," he said, adjusting his position. "Sight alignment, sight picture." He could feel Morrison's critical gaze analyzing his every movement. "Your left elbow is too far under the rifle," Morrison observed. "You're creating an unstable platform. And relax your grip, you're white-knuckling the stock." Rodriguez made the adjustments, but the changes felt awkward and unnatural. When he fired, the shot went even wider than before. His frustration finally boiled over. "This is ridiculous," he exploded, pulling his head away from the scope. "There's something wrong with this rifle. The trigger feels different. The balance is off. How am I supposed to shoot accurately with defective equipment?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Rodriguez was essentially claiming that the Navy's precision rifle system, a weapon that had been proven accurate in the hands of thousands of operators, was somehow flawed. It was the kind of excuse that would mark him as someone who blamed his tools rather than examining his technique. Morrison's expression darkened. In 15 years of training SEALs, he'd learned to distinguish between legitimate equipment issues and shooter error. This was clearly the latter, but Rodriguez seemed determined to avoid taking responsibility. "The rifle is not defective," Morrison said coldly. "The issue is, the rifle's fine." The voice came from behind the target line, clear and confident despite its soft volume. Every head on the firing line turned toward the sound, expecting to see another instructor or range officer. Instead, they saw Madison Foster, the young range assistant, who'd been quietly changing targets all morning. Morrison blinked in surprise. In all his years of training at various facilities, he'd never had range staff offer unsolicited commentary on a shooter's performance. The girl looked barely old enough to be out of high school, and she was contradicting a Navy SEAL in front of his entire team. "Excuse me?" Morrison said, his voice carrying a warning edge. Madison realized she'd just made a serious mistake. She'd been watching Rodriguez's struggles for the past hour, and when he blamed the rifle, her father's voice had overridden her common sense. Now 8 elite warriors were staring at her, and she had to either retreat with her tail between her legs or stand behind what she'd said. Her father's training won. "You're pulling your shots left because you're anticipating recoil," she continued, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your grip is inconsistent, your breathing pattern is erratic, and you're jerking the trigger instead of pressing it straight back." The silence that followed was deafening. Rodriguez's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. Being corrected by an instructor was one thing. Being diagnosed by a civilian range employee in front of his teammates was humiliating beyond words. "Are you kidding me?" he sputtered, rising from behind the rifle. "Some college kid who changes targets for a living is going to tell me how to shoot." Madison felt her pulse spike, but she held her ground. "I'm just saying what I observed. The equipment isn't the problem." Morrison studied the young woman with calculating eyes. Her assessment of Rodriguez's shooting problems had been technically accurate. He'd noticed the same issues but hadn't yet figured out how to correct them. The question was, how did a range assistant develop that level of diagnostic skill? And what makes you qualified to make that assessment? Morrison asked, his tone neutral but probing. Madison hesitated. Revealing her background felt too personal, too close to memories she'd spent years avoiding. But she'd already committed to this path, and backing down now would only make things worse. "My father taught me to shoot," she said simply. "I know what proper technique looks like." Chen snorted dismissively. "Yeah? Well, my father taught me to drive, but that doesn't make me qualified to coach NASCAR." The comment drew chuckles from some of the other SEALs, but Morrison held up a hand for silence. Something about the girl's confidence intrigued him. She wasn't showing off or seeking attention. She genuinely seemed to believe what she was saying. "Tell you what," Morrison said, making a decision that would change everything. "Rodriguez has been trying to hit that target all morning. You think you can do better?" Madison's stomach dropped. She'd wanted to correct Rodriguez's misconceptions, not demonstrate her own shooting ability. The last time she'd fired a rifle was 6 years ago, during her final range session with her father. She had no idea whether the skills were still there. But Morrison was already moving toward the rifle, checking the chamber and safety with practiced efficiency. Same target, same rifle, same conditions. You make the shot, and I'll listen to whatever else you have to say about technique. You miss. He paused, his meaning clear. Rodriguez crossed his arms with a smirk. This should be good. College girl thinks she can outshoot a Navy SEAL. The other team members formed a loose semicircle behind the firing line, their expressions ranging from amused skepticism to genuine curiosity. Madison realized she was trapped. Accepting the challenge risked public humiliation, but backing down would confirm their assumption that she was just another know-it-all civilian with no real experience. Morrison held out the rifle. "What's it going to be?" Madison looked at the weapon in his hands, then at the expectant faces surrounding her. For a moment she could almost hear her father's voice from one of their last range sessions. "Confidence is just competence that's been tested under pressure." She took the rifle. The weight surprised her. It was heavier than her father's hunting rifle, with a different balance point, and a scope that felt foreign against her cheek. But the fundamentals were the same, and as her hands found their positions on the stock and grip, muscle memory began to surface. "Same target Rodriguez was shooting at?" she asked, settling into a prone position behind the rifle. 500 yards, center of the bullseye, Morrison confirmed, moving to his spotting scope. 10 ring is about 8 inches across. Madison adjusted her position, making subtle changes until her body felt stable and natural. She could feel the weight of 8 pairs of eyes on her back, and the pressure was unlike anything she'd experienced. But as she settled behind the scope and found her sight picture, the range seemed to fade away. The target was clear and sharp in the magnified view. She could see the wind flags hanging limp in the still morning air, eliminating one variable from the equation. Her breathing naturally slowed as she found her rhythm. Inhale, exhale, halfway, natural pause, press. "You know," Rodriguez said loudly, clearly trying to break her concentration, "there's a big difference between theory and practice. Easy to talk technique when you're not the one." Rodriguez Morrison's voice cut through the commentary like a blade. "Shut up." Madison tuned out the distraction and focused on the fundamentals her father had drilled into her. Sight alignment, natural point of aim, trigger control. The crosshairs settled on the center of the target, and she began her trigger press. Smooth, straight back with follow-through. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the range. Through the scope, Madison saw a small puff of dust appear at the base of the target stand, indicating her bullet had struck low. "Miss," Rodriguez said triumphantly. "Told you there's a difference between correction," Morrison interrupted, his voice tight with surprise. "That's a dead center, perfect elevation, maybe a quarter-inch left of the X-ring." Madison worked the bolt smoothly and settled back into position. The first shot had been for sight picture and to judge the rifle's characteristics. The second would be for precision. This time, there was no hesitation. The crosshairs found their mark. Her breathing settled into the natural pause, and the trigger broke cleanly. The second shot followed milliseconds later, and through the scope, Madison could see exactly where it had impacted. 2 for 2, Morrison announced, his professional composure cracking slightly. Same hole, center mass. But Madison wasn't finished. Without lifting her head from the scope, she worked the bolt again and fired a third shot, then a fourth, then a fifth, each one placed with deliberate precision. When she finally lifted her head from the rifle, the range was completely silent except for the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. Morrison was studying the target through his spotting scope, his expression unreadable. Finally he lowered the scope and looked at Madison with something approaching awe. 5 shots. 1.2-inch group. Dead center, he announced to the team. "That's better shooting than most of us managed this morning." The silence that followed Morrison's announcement felt heavier than the morning fog. Rodriguez stared at the spotting scope as if it had personally betrayed him, while the other SEALs exchanged glances that spoke volumes about what they'd just witnessed. Madison carefully saved the rifle and handed it back to Morrison, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She'd just outperformed a Navy SEAL in front of his entire team, and the implications of that achievement were beginning to sink in. "That's impossible," Rodriguez muttered, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "Nobody shoots that well with an unfamiliar rifle on their first try." Morrison was still studying Madison with calculating eyes. "Where did you really learn to shoot?" Madison felt heat rise in her cheeks. The attention was exactly what she'd spent 9 months trying to avoid, but there was no going back now. "My father was Staff Sergeant Michael Foster, Army Rangers. He taught me starting when I was 12. The name recognition was immediate. Chen straightened slightly, his dismissive attitude evaporating. "Foster, wasn't he with the 75th? Afghanistan 2016. Madison nodded, surprised. "You knew him, knew of him?" Chen replied with newfound respect. "My unit worked with the Rangers on a joint operation. Your father had a reputation as one of the best marksmen in the battalion. If he trained you, that explains a lot." The revelation changed the atmosphere entirely. The SEALs were no longer looking at her as a presumptuous college kid, but as the daughter of a respected warrior. It was a legacy Madison had spent years trying to escape, but now it felt like armor against their skepticism. Morrison leaned against the shooting bench, his instructor's mind clearly working. "How long since you've shot competitively?" "I don't compete," Madison replied. "This was just something my dad and I did together before." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Before what?" Morrison pressed gently. "Before he deployed. Before the IED." Madison's voice was quiet but steady. I haven't touched a rifle in 6 years until just now. The admission hung in the air like a revelation. Rodriguez was staring at her with a mixture of disbelief and growing respect. 6 years away from shooting, and she'd just embarrassed him with a weapon she'd never fired before. 6 years, Morrison repeated slowly. And you just shot a sub-Moe group at 500 yards with no warm-up, no familiarization, no sight adjustments. Madison shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. My father always said shooting was like riding a bike. The fundamentals don't change. The fundamentals don't, Morrison agreed. But muscle memory fades. Hand-eye coordination deteriorates. What you just did, he paused, searching for words. That's not normal. Petty Officer Jenkins, the team's medic, spoke up for the first time. Ma'am, what you demonstrated isn't just good shooting. That's instructor-level precision under pressure. Most people would have choked with this many people watching. Madison didn't know how to respond to that. She'd never thought of her performance as exceptional. It was simply what her father had taught her to do. Apply the fundamentals consistently. Control your breathing. Don't overthink the shot. Morrison was studying her with the analytical eye of someone who'd spent years evaluating potential. Madison, what are your plans after college? The question seemed to come from nowhere. I'm studying business administration. I guess I'll find an office job somewhere. You ever consider law enforcement, military, any field where precision shooting might be relevant? Madison shook her head. I just want to finish school and find steady work, nothing dramatic. Morrison exchanged a meaningful look with Chen, then made a decision that would reshape Madison's future. What would you say to some informal coaching? Rodriguez could use help with his fundamentals, and frankly, so could some of the others. You obviously understand the technical aspects, and you can demonstrate proper execution. I'm not qualified to teach Navy SEALs, Madison protested. You just proved otherwise. Morrison replied, teaching is about more than credentials. It's about understanding why things work, and being able to communicate that understanding. You diagnosed Rodriguez's problems faster than I did, and your demonstration was flawless. Rodriguez, who had been unusually quiet during the exchange, finally spoke up. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I was acting like an ass, because I was frustrated with my own performance. If you're willing to help me figure out what I'm doing wrong, I'd be grateful. The transformation in his attitude was complete. The angry, defensive SEAL had been replaced by someone genuinely seeking improvement. Madison could see the sincerity in his eyes, and despite her reservations, she found herself nodding. I can try, she said, but I'm still learning too. Fair enough, Morrison said. How about we start with the basics? Walk Rodriguez through your shooting process step by step, show him what proper form looks like. For the next hour, Madison found herself in the surreal position of coaching a Navy SEAL. She demonstrated proper body position, explained breathing techniques, and walked Rodriguez through trigger control exercises. Her father's voice guided her instruction, translating complex concepts into simple, actionable steps. The change in Rodriguez's shooting was immediate and dramatic. With proper guidance, his shots began grouping consistently, and his confidence returned. The other team members gathered around to observe, asking questions and taking notes on techniques they could apply to their own shooting. Morrison watched the impromptu lesson with growing interest. Madison had a natural teaching ability, breaking down complex skills into digestible components and adjusting her instruction based on each shooter's individual needs. It was a rare talent, especially in someone so young. As the session wound down, Morrison approached Madison privately. I want to make you an offer. The Navy contracts with civilian instructors for specialized training. Your technical knowledge and teaching ability would be valuable assets. Madison's first instinct was to decline. She'd built her life around avoiding exactly this kind of attention. But as she looked around at the SEALs who had spent the afternoon listening to her instruction with genuine respect, she realized something had changed. For the first time since her father's death, she felt connected to the world he'd loved. What would that involve? She asked. Consultation work mostly. Help develop training curricula, work with struggling shooters, maybe some instructor development. The pay would be significantly better than changing targets, and the schedule could work around your class commitment. Madison thought about her younger brother's college fund, her mother's overtime shifts, the constant financial pressure that had shaped every decision since her father's death. The opportunity Morrison was offering represented more than just better pay. It was a chance to honor her father's memory while building a meaningful career. Can I think about it? She asked. Take all the time you need, Morrison replied. But Madison, understand that what happened here today doesn't happen often. Talent like yours is rare, and it would be a waste not to develop it. 3 days later, Madison called the number Morrison had given her. The conversation led to a meeting with Commander Patricia Walsh, the officer in charge of SEAL training development, who offered Madison a civilian contractor position that would change her life. The work started small, observing training sessions and providing feedback on curriculum development. But as Madison's reputation spread through the special operations community, her responsibilities expanded. She found herself working with not just SEALs, but Marines, Army Rangers, and federal law enforcement agencies. Her approach was different from traditional military instruction, where most training focused on repetition and adherence to doctrine. Madison emphasized understanding the why behind each technique. She helped shooters develop personal systems based on their individual strengths and weaknesses, rather than forcing everyone into the same template. The financial impact was immediate and significant. Madison was able to quit her range job, reduce her class load to part-time status, and still earn more than she'd made working full-time. More importantly, she could afford to move her family out of their cramped apartment and start building the college fund her brother would need. But the real transformation was personal. For 6 years, Madison had avoided anything that reminded her of her father's world. Now she was immersed in it, surrounded by warriors who spoke his language and shared his values. The grief that had driven her away from shooting gradually transformed into something else: pride in carrying forward his legacy. Rodriguez became one of her most dedicated students. Under her guidance, his precision shooting improved dramatically, and he eventually qualified as the team's designated marksman. More importantly, he learned to diagnose and correct his own mistakes, becoming a better instructor for other struggling shooters. 6 months after that first morning on the range, Madison received an unexpected visitor. She was conducting a training session at Quantico when a Marine colonel approached her during a break. "Miss Foster, I'm Colonel James Harrison, and I wanted to thank you personally." Madison looked up from her equipment, confused. "Thank me for what, sir?" "For teaching my son." Harrison's stern expression softened slightly. "Lieutenant David Harrison, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. He was struggling with long-range work until he attended one of your courses. Your instruction probably saved his life in Kandahar last month." The words hit Madison like a physical blow. She'd known intellectually that her training had practical applications, but hearing about its real-world impact brought everything into sharp focus. The techniques she taught, the problems she helped solve, the confidence she helped build, all of it mattered in ways she was only beginning to understand. As her reputation grew, so did the opportunity. She was invited to speak at training conferences, contribute to curriculum development, and consult on equipment procurement. Major firearms manufacturers sought her input on new products, and military training commands competed for her time. But Madison never forgot where it all started, with a frustrated SEAL blaming his equipment and a range assistant who couldn't stay quiet. She made it a point to work with struggling shooters personally, knowing that sometimes all it took was one person willing to offer honest feedback and patient instruction. 2 years after that transformative morning at the Oceanside Range, Madison Foster stood before a packed auditorium at the Naval War College, delivering the keynote address at the annual Precision Marksmanship Symposium. The shy college student who once changed targets for minimum wage had become one of the most respected shooting instructors in the military community. Her presentation focused on the human factors in marksmanship training, the psychological and physiological elements that separated good shooters from great ones. It was a topic she'd become passionate about, combining her father's practical wisdom with her own observations and research. In the audience sat many of the people who had shaped her journey. Morrison, now a Master Chief, smiled with pride as his former discovery shared insights that would influence training programs across the armed forces. Rodriguez, recently promoted and assigned to instructor duty himself, took detailed notes on techniques he could apply to his own students. But the moment that meant the most came after her presentation, when a young Marine approached her with obvious nervousness. "Ma'am, I'm Corporal Jackson and I wanted to thank you. I attended one of your courses last year and the breathing technique you taught me, it made all the difference during my deployment." Madison smiled, remembering her own nervousness the first time she'd addressed a group of professionals. "I'm glad it helped, Corporal. What specifically made the difference?" "Understanding why proper breathing matters, not just how to do it. You explained the physiology, the way oxygen affects fine motor control, the relationship between heart rate and natural point of aim. Once I understood the science, I could apply it consistently." That was Madison's signature approach, treating students as intelligent professionals capable of understanding complex concepts, rather than simply memorizing procedures. It was a philosophy her father had instilled in her, and one that had proven effective across hundreds of training sessions. After the symposium, Madison drove to Arlington National Cemetery, a pilgrimage she made every year on the anniversary of her father's death. She knelt beside his grave and spoke quietly about her work, her students, and the ways his training continued to influence others. "I think you'd be proud, Dad," she said, placing fresh flowers on the headstone. "I'm using what you taught me to help others the way you helped me, and I finally understand what you meant about shooting being about more than just hitting targets." The wind rustled through the trees, and Madison felt a peace she hadn't experienced since childhood. Her father's legacy lived on, not just in her memory, but in every student she trained, every technique she refined, every life that might be saved by the skills she passed on. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Morrison. "New SEAL class starts Monday. They're struggling with fundamental." "Interested?" Madison smiled as she typed her reply. "Absolutely. Same terms as always. We fix the problems, not blame the equipment." Walking back to her car, Madison reflected on the strange path that had brought her here. A moment of speaking up when she should have stayed silent had transformed her from an invisible employee into a recognized expert. It had taught her that sometimes the most important opportunities come disguised as simple choices, the choice to care enough to speak truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Her father had been right about shooting being like surgery. It required patience, precision, and the ability to control your body under pressure. But Madison had discovered it was also like teaching. It required understanding people as much as techniques, and sometimes the most profound lessons came from the most unexpected sources. The Navy SEAL who had thrown down his rifle in frustration that October morning could never have imagined that his moment of weakness would launch a career that would influence thousands of warriors. But that's how the best stories often begin. Not with grand gestures or obvious heroes, but with ordinary people who choose to act when action is needed. Madison Foster had learned that expertise could emerge from the most unlikely places, that teaching was as much about courage as knowledge, that sometimes the greatest honor came not from recognition, but from the quiet satisfaction of knowing you'd made a difference in ways that might never be fully measured. As she drove away from Arlington, Madison's phone was already ringing with calls from training commands, equipment manufacturers, and military units seeking her expertise. The invisible range assistant was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that the most powerful weapon any warrior could possess was the knowledge to use their tools effectively. And in training rooms across the country, instructors would continue teaching the Foster method, approach to marksmanship that emphasized understanding over memorization, patience over pressure, and the fundamental truth that good shooting, like good teaching, was built on respect for both the craft and the people learning it. The transformation was complete, but the mission continued. Every day brought new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to honor the memory of a ranger who had taught his daughter that the most important lessons were the ones you passed on to others. Sometimes a single shot really could change everything.